Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Mike DeBernardis for another season of the Corruption Files. Mike, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. Really psyched for season two.
So, as I said in the introduction, we're going to take a look at some of the earlier scandals that led to the creation of various anti-bribery, anti-corruption laws, and bring some of those scandals up after the turn of the century as well. But we wanted to maybe start with the beginning, not at the beginning scandal, but at one that led to the creation of the FCPA, and that's the Lockheed scandal of the 60s and 70s. Mike, do you want to tell our audience a little bit about this scandal?
Happy to. And we talk a lot, Tom. I think maybe every other episode we're on together, we mentioned that they could make a movie out of this. So I think this one they truly could. The Lockheed scandal, we're going back now to really the 60s and the 70s is when the bulk of the misconduct took place. The scandal itself broke in the 70s, and it involved, as you mentioned, Lockheed Corporation, a major aerospace and defense company still today. And it had really significant repercussions here in the US in terms of led really more or less directly to the FCPA and other reporting obligations in the US. And then had really major political implications outside the US and foreign countries involved. At bottom, what we had was Lockheed, particularly as it was dealing with financial issues in the 1960s and 1970s. The way that they dealt with those financial difficulties was to increase sales of its aircraft in foreign countries through bribes, and mostly bribes through our favorite method, which is third-party sales reps and consultants. Strategy was at a very high level. We're talking about bribes paid to ministers, to presidents in certain instances. And in the Netherlands, I believe it was a prince who was alleged to have received the bribes. And I know you'll get into that in a little bit, but this was very high level corruption. It was also at a really alarming scale. I think ultimately, after all the investigations were concluded, Lockheed admitted that it paid $155 million in commissions to foreign agents over a 5-year period, I think 1970 and 1975. We were talking that equates to about $1.3 billion in today's money. I think I saw something else that they admitted that at least 38 million of that were bribe payments. And that's in the neighborhood of $240 million. And the reality is it was likely more. And a big sort of set cornerstone or focus for the bribe payments was to increase sales of its wide body commercial airliner. And they were competing with Boeing and others in the sale of that. One of the really interesting things here, Tom, is how this came out, right? How did the Lockheed, this is before the FCPA, of course, right? So we don't have voluntary disclosure programs and whistleblowing set up. So how did this come out? And when you take it back, it really, in a roundabout way, in some ways came out in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal, where you had prosecutors looking at potential illegal campaign contributions. And of course, Congress is interested in the issue. And in connection with that, you had some major US corporations admitting to large, off the books, domestic political contributions. And that caught the attention of the SEC, thinking, wow, these off the books payments might be something that is material to investors. We need to sort of address this issue. And so they did. And they started looking into the issue and realized that many of these payments were made through slush funds, right? So the companies would create slush funds to make domestic payments and record them in some different way. And lo and behold, as they're looking at this, they realize, wow, actually, it looks like some of these companies are also using these slush funds to make payment to foreign governments or foreign government officials in return for contracts. So they started a program to try to get companies, when they realized the scale, to get companies to voluntarily disclose these issues. The media attention and congressional attention increased on these issues. And next thing you know, you have major corporations coming into Congress testifying on what the types of payments they're making to foreign governments. I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of the first ones in the door testifying was Northrop. And Northrop said something like, all we're doing is following the Lockheed model. And that turned the attention to Lockheed, where there was already some attention because of the financial difficulties I mentioned before. Lockheed had received a large loan from the U.S. government and was already kind of under scrutiny. And ultimately, the president of Lockheed testified to a congressional committee that, at the very least at the time, he admitted that Lockheed had paid over $12 million of bribes just in Japan. And then the scandal sort of spiraled from there. The payments, we'll get into, I think, covered Japan, Saudi Arabia, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and others. And I think if you look at articles from back then, you'll see that sort of every day there was a new article kind of making the scandal, telling new facts that really revealed the full scope and breadth of the scandal. And we'll talk about the ultimate impact of it. But I think I want to tell everybody a little bit about sort of the impact this had on the countries involved, because it was initially a domestic issue, but it turned into sort of an international.
Before we do, I want to pick up on really one of your points, which was how huge this was in the 70s, and to the point where in researching for this podcast, I found articles in the New Yorker about this scandal. And the New Yorker is still one of the top magazines in the country, and it was even bigger back then. And that's how big and ubiquitous this scandal was. We often, or I don't think we talk enough, Mike, about the invidiousness of bribery and its impact on the countries where the bribes were paid. But we had significant bribes paid to U.S. allies and significant political fallout from those bribes being paid. One was, or you mentioned Japan, and their Prime Minister Tanaka was, I believe, criminally charged. And on this case, he certainly had to resign. In Italy, the entire Christian Democratic Party government had to resign because of Lockheed's payment of bribes to several party members. And Italy has never been really, or at least in the last century, was politically stable. And this led to even more instability. One of my favorite stories was I had a professor who met an Italian parliamentary member who talked about running up the steps of parliament under gunfire. That was fairly routine in Italy back then. But it led to, or contributed to, a long period of political instability. The prime minister and the president of Italy were forced to resign. In the Netherlands, the scandal went up to the royal family, and Prince Bernard, the husband of Queen Juliana, was accused of accepting over $1 million in bribe payment to influence the Dutch country's or Dutch government's decisions to buy Lockheed aircraft. He vehemently denied the charges. The Queen said that if he was criminally charged, she would resign. That sort of went away, but he was stripped of all royal duties and even the right to wear his military uniform in public. At the end of his life, interestingly, he finally admitted that he had taken the bribe, with the witticism that Lockheed will be on my tombstone, and probably not in a favorable way. We typically didn't get, since we've been alive, bribes taken by royal family members. Admittedly, there are very few royal family members at the top in the world anymore, but those people tend to be squeaky clean. And particularly from the Netherlands, which is generally perceived as one of the cleanest countries for this, it was a huge scandal within the Netherlands. Germany also saw an interesting twist on bribery allegations in that country. In the 60s, there was an allegation that a member of the German Bundestag, one Manfred Lorner, had accepted a bribe from Lockheed, and payment and something that we both hold near and dear to our hearts, a paid trip to the United States to visit the Lockheed facility. There was never any proof that he had been paid cash, and he threatened to sue for slander, or libel, I should say. This was in the 60s. The case either was never filed or it sort of went away. But in the 70s, when the scandal with Lockheed became public, it became a huge scandal within Germany because there were allegedly documents documenting all of the bribes paid to German government officials, and they were called the Lockheed Papers. And there were several government commissions, parliamentary commissions, trying to determine if the German executive had destroyed them. And the best they determined was that bribes had been, or documents relating to the Lockheed scandal had been destroyed by the German government. And this led to even a period of instability in Germany, which in the post-war era was incredibly stable for the most part. So you see the invidiousness of bribes being paid, contributing to government instability and political instability in countries. We tend to focus, when I say we, I mean you and I tend to focus on sort of the modern era of FCPA enforcement, post 9/11, post 2004, post Siemens, where at least I draw the line from corruption to crime to terrorism. But this, in reviewing the Lockheed scandal, you also see how corruption leads to political instability. And this is with our allies. This is not with countries that we weren't very close to at the time. I think it's really a refresher, was a refresher for me in the research to remember and understand really in how invidious bribes can be and how they can corrupt an entire country, not simply the people who receive the bribes going forward. I think that's an important lesson that maybe we don't focus on as much, certainly in the post 9/11 world.
I think that's totally fair. And part of it is that, as I mentioned, the sort of high level here, we're talking about leaders of countries. And there was, as you and I were discussing before the pod, there was some disagreement within the U.S. about whether to disclose all the details of who these bribes were paid to because of the potential implications and ramifications for the countries involved. Especially, as you mentioned, these are our allies, and ultimately the side arguing for disclosure won out. But even when they disclosed, particularly related to Japan, right? Japan wanted to know, right? The news came out that Lockheed had paid $12 million in bribes to Japanese officials, and Japan, of course, wanted to know who. And the method that they came up with initially to disclose that information to Japan was really not very transparent. They were kind of rolling the names very slowly and trying to keep it very confidential. Ultimately, it all came to light, but fallout was incredible. And this is actually all happening, if you put this in context, around the same time as the banana scandal in Honduras, where United Food, or whatever the name of the company was at the time, had been paying bribes to Honduras officials to ease taxes or allow the easy export of bananas, and ultimately led directly to a coup in that country and really destabilized that country for years and years. I actually think ultimately when we ended up with the FCPA, a big part of that and the reasoning to say, hey, we got to fix this issue is because there was a realization that these, not just the scandals themselves, but the bribes can have really destabilizing effects and a big effect on our foreign policy.
The other thing that I'd like to remind our listeners of is you mentioned the banana scandal or fruit scandal out of Central America. This is still the post-Watergate era. And there is a huge shift in public opinion around transparency and accountability. So I think the cumulative effect, we also had the Church Committee investigating alleged abuses by the CIA from the 60s. So we had lots of sort of openness in government. And when the corporate scandal came along, I think that some of the other political scandals really laid the foundation to make people ready for a change. And that, of course, leads us to Stanley Sporkin, who in many ways is the either father or grandfather of the FCPA. And he was with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And the apocryphal story that I've heard is actually true, was that he was watching the hearings on television and he began to wonder what else is in those books and records. And that directly led to a books and records component to the FCPA, which in many ways, in my mind, is the stronger requirement because it's a vicarious liability. It's no balls. It's absolute liability. Although you don't typically get as large a fine and penalty from the SEC, you can. But it was a group of senators who came together to pass this legislation. In another life, I had to research the congressional hearings on it. And they took this work very seriously. And they really went into the weeds on how Lockheed and other major U.S. companies were paying bribes to try to create a law that would make those steps unavailable. Having said that, 100% of the bribes in Lockheed were paid through third parties. And 2024, 100% of the companies who had enforcement actions against them paid bribes through third parties. So query how much have we actually moved forward. But really, any thoughts you might have on the creation of the FCPA, its enactment into law, what businesses were saying at the time? I've got another non-apocryphal family story I want to share in a minute.
Yeah, for sure. It's really interesting to see the sequence of events here from scandal directly to the SEC and Mr. Sporkin and the into the FCPA. And there was a great debate at the time about, to your point about the books and records being the stronger provision. There was a great debate about whether we needed anti-bribery provisions at all. If we have this books and records provision, and we're saying, okay, Lockheed, Northrop, whoever you are, you want to pay bribes, knock yourself out. You got to detail it, right? You're going to put this in your public filing. And if we make you do that, we think you're not going to be paying bribes in the first place. There was a great push that was enough. We don't need the anti-bribery provision. I think there's probably something to that. I do think it's interesting, 50 years now forward, and this Lockheed case, which centered around payments to third-party agents, and we still talk about, every time we do a podcast on the FCPA, we talk about in some form or fashion the risk of third parties, and particularly third-party agents. To your point, not much has changed. I would argue that really a ton has changed. The schemes have necessarily had to get more sophisticated, much harder to pull off something like Lockheed did here. The penalties are obviously much greater. At the end of this whole scandal, Lockheed did settle with the SEC for, I think it was a Securities Act violation. They paid no penalty, did not have to admit or deny anything. I think the only sort of long-term impact of their settlement was that for a long time, I think until very recently, they had to report to the SEC if they were going to make a change to their anti-corruption compliance policies. And today, it would be fun to sort of run numbers and see what the penalty could potentially look like for something like this today, paying at a minimum $240 million in bribes and all the fallout from it. At least that's changed. Stakes have really increased for the companies.
What was one of the largest or one of the biggest arguments brought by the U.S. business community at the time was not that bribes were just a part of doing business, although they did argue that. What they argued, Mike, was that U.S. businesses would be in a deficit or deficiency because no other country in the world in 1977 had an anti-bribery, anti-corruption law. So U.S. businesses, there would not be a level playing field. And I know that from research, and actually I had an uncle tell me that once, that he thought this was the stupidest law ever, that everybody else in the world could pay bribes and he couldn't. And he didn't think that was fair. That got addressed perhaps a little bit by the OECD. And interestingly to me, part of the pressure for the OECD to put pressure on other countries came from the United States. So there was a change in, I think, 97 or 98, and then the U.S. accepted that change with some amendments to the FCPA. Want to maybe walk us through that part of the history up to sort of the modern era?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And you're exactly right. I mean, I think back in the 70s, while they're just debating the FCPA, there was a large discussion, an open discussion about this, about how even portions of the U.S. government had almost encouraged this type of conduct. You need to increase foreign investment, and this is how you do it, and this is how business is done. And I think the Secretary of Commerce at the time in the 70s made an argument that the FCPA would really hurt U.S. interests, and we should consider whether it's necessary. And then there was an evolution, right? In a lot of ways, right? We passed the FCPA. We talked about in the past. It wasn't heavily enforced at first. When we get into the 90s, and I think the impact of corruption more generally became a topic that governments were willing to talk about. Obviously, the geopolitical impact, the socioeconomic impact, and it became more acceptable to treat it as a problem that perhaps at least fully developed nations should really try to counter. And there, through significant pressure by the U.S. and heavy negotiating, as you mentioned, we came to a place I think you're right, it was 90s, where with an agreement from the OECD and the OECD Convention on Combating Bribery, the U.S. made a small change to the FCPA, as you mentioned, and we sort of, I think, entered the modern legislative era, I would say, of anti-corruption, although I think the modern enforcement era didn't start for maybe another, I don't know, 7 or 8 years. It probably took a little bit of time, I think, following the passage of the revised FCPA and the OECD countries adopting their own legislation for the investigations to come to the point where we were seeing some of the sort of modern settlements that are sort of common in today's time. But the history and the evolution of the FCPA from that context is really incredible and interesting, and it's remarkable how far. I know there's always room for improvement, but how far we've come since those days in the late 70s, where it was okay, we're going to pass this law 'cause it's the right thing to do, but it does put us at a competitive disadvantage, and maybe we don't actively enforce it to today, where this is if you're a major corporation and you don't have an active and aggressive anti-corruption program, you are considered to be you're really unsophisticated.
One of the additional kind of outfalls from this was that the airline or aircraft manufacturing industry, I should say, in many ways led the discussion around compliance programs, particularly in the late 80s and early 90s, because they had to. You mentioned Lockheed and the agreement they were under. Some of the very earliest compliance practitioners I've ever met came out of the airline industry or aircraft manufacturing, not airlines, aircraft manufacturing industry. And obviously Boeing is still around today, but at one point, the world's biggest FCPA enforcement action or worldwide anti-corruption enforcement action was Airbus. The issues still exist today, and aircraft manufacturing companies have to be ever vigilant because their customers are always foreign governments. So the risk will always be there for them.
And the stakes are huge. I think it's sort of perfect storm where these are massive contracts that can really make or break a quarter or a year's worth of performance, right? We just got part of Airbus was getting a huge deal from Ethiopia on the Airbus 380. That has just a massive impact.
Mike, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode. It's been a ton of fun. I look forward to our next episode.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.